doctrine of last things. We introduced it, and this is actually week 3, I guess, of this. We kind of introduced it and then talked about, I guess we spent 2 weeks doing an introduction. We did a millennium overview last week. And there's a lot more to eschatology, which is the doctrine of last things. A whole lot more to it than discussing the millennium. But because that's kind of the dividing point, that is why the various end time views are called millennial views. Pre-millennial, amillennial, post-millennial, and variations in between. Even though it's all based off of one passage in Revelation chapter 20. The only time this 1,000-year reign of Christ with believers is mentioned, the only time that is specifically mentioned is in a very symbolic book and mentioned one time. But it's very fitting that that is what distinguishes our positions. So you guys who weren't here last week, you have a chart, and on the other side you've got on the front side historic premillennialism. On the back side you've got dispensational premillennialism, amillennialism, and postmillennialism. And dealing with the 1,000-year reign of Christ, we're going to look today at historic premillennialism. It is also known as classic premillennialism. And just by way of reminder, eschatology, we know what ology is. Theology, biology, right? Geology. But the word eschatos or eschaton is the word for last, or last things. And so it's the study of last things, eschatology. And eschatology, for the most part, is a secondary issue. So there are these 4 major millennial views. You can pick one and you can hold to it with all your heart, and I can pick another one and hold to it with all of my heart, and we can both still be saved. There are those essential issues. We must believe that Christ is returning. We must believe in the future resurrection, future judgment, future victory of Christ. We must believe in those things, but the timing of certain events we're going to differ on. So we must affirm some things, but everything else is a secondary or even a tertiary issue. So there's no question that Christ will return. The question is when he will return, specifically as it relates to the millennium. So today we're going to slow down and not spend a lot of time here, but we're going to slow down and look at historic or classic premillennialism. And the teaching aim today is to explain historic premillennialism, its key claims, biblical arguments, and distinguishing features, the things that set it apart from the others, so we can clearly understand what the view teaches, why Christians hold it, and specifically in relation with this millennial view, how it differs from dispensational premillennialism. We're going to look at that one more in depth next week. But just so you know, have you seen the Left Behind movies, or have you read the Left Behind books? The old movies had Kirk Cameron in them, right? And it's very, we might can understand it this way. It's a very literal understanding of apocalyptic literature. It's a very literal understanding of Revelation. But you've got everyone just living their regular, normal life, then all of a sudden all the Christians vanish, right? Christians are just gone like that. Can't be explained. The Christians driving the cars are now, no one's driving them and they're crashing, right? Planes in the sky when the Christian pilots are raptured, right? The planes crash and you go into a 7-year tribulation where there's no Christians on the earth. Well, it depends on your dispensational view. Then at the end of that, Christ returns, sets up the 1,000-year kingdom, binds Satan. That's dispensationalism. And we're going to look more, of course, at that next week. But the prefix pre means before. And the pre-millennial position says that Christ will return, will come back to earth before the millennium. It is called historic or classical premillennialism because many argue that it can be traced to the very first century. It's one thing to look at the apostles' writings, right? The New Testament that we have. and come to conclusions on eschatology. It's another thing to look at secondary authors, secondary writers, and church fathers who speak to the issue. Because then we're able to see, now that's not scripture, right? Secondary non-biblical authors are not scripture, but we're able to see how they understood the scripture they were reading. So many can trace it all the way back to the late first and into the second century. And people have been historic premillennial for 2,000 years. It is a very ancient millennial position. It teaches that the present church age, we're living in the church age now, it will continue until, as it nears the end, a time of great tribulation and suffering comes on the earth. One distinguishing mark between historic premillennialism and the left behind dispensational premillennialism is historic premillennialism goes through the church, Christians go through the 7-year tribulation. Dispensationalism that we'll look at next week, the church is raptured and the rest of the world goes through the 7-year tribulation. And then they're both the same at the end of that 7 years when Christ returns with the saints, right? But after that time of the tribulation, we have what we would call the end of the church age. Christ will return to earth to establish a millennial kingdom. And believers who have died will be raised, and their bodies will be reunited with their spirits, and they will reign with Christ on earth for 1,000 years. Most premillennialists understand that to be a literal figure, that the 1,000-year reign will be 1,000 years. It doesn't have to be. And some historic premillennialists understand, man, it just means a long time, right? This is a very apocalyptic book. You see all the symbolism in Revelation, and then you come to the number 1,000, and well, that must mean exactly 1,000. So there's some fluidity there where it really means a long time. 1,000 years is a long time, right? But it could be longer. I think I mentioned this last week. Scripture says that God owns the cattle of 1,000 hills, right? With 1,001st hill, I guess the devil owns it. That's not what that passage means. It means God owns all the cattle of all the hills. God is faithful to 1,000 generations, but that 1,001st generation, they're in trouble, right? No, it just means God is faithful. And the number 1,000 just highlights that he's extremely faithful for a long, long period of time. And actually, God is always faithful, right? Resurrected believers and those alive at Christ's return will receive resurrected, glorified bodies that will never die, and they will live on earth and reign with Christ for 1,000 years. Let's say I die today, and for historic premillennialism, let's say I die today, and y'all bury me in the ground in a few days. My spirit, my immaterial part goes to be with the Lord. And then let's say the tribulation time starts in about 10 years, right? Let's just say. And then you guys are going through this hard time of persecution, this hard time of tribulation. But at the end of that, Christ returns. And as he returns, you are going to receive glorified bodies. Like if you're sick like me, you're instantly not going to be sick anymore, right? You're going to receive a glorified body. If you're like me, you're going to then have a full head of hair. I don't have a full head of hair right now, right? You're going to receive a glorified body. But for you, that's going to happen. For me, I'm going to instantly be raised from the dead and receive the same glorified body as you. So when Christ returns, according to historic premillennialism, it's after the 7-year worldwide tribulation, this heavy persecution on the earth. And believers are raised from the dead, and believers who are alive are immediately changed and glorified. And Christ shows up, binds the devil, casts him into the bottomless pit, and sets up the millennial kingdom. Not everybody on earth is going to willingly submit to Christ. There's going to be unbelievers who are still going to be staunch unbelievers and staunch rebels against Christ, and they're going to have to serve him. They're going to have to obey him. They're going to have to do what he says. They just might not like it. Now, many, according to historic premillennialism, many, maybe even most of the world will become Christian. They will be converted, and become Christian and join the rest of us glorified believers. Some premillennialists see this time, this millennial reign, this 1,000-year kingdom, as the time when creation is remade, the new heavens and new earth. Not all do. Others see that reign of Christ is on this present earth in its present state. And then at the end of the 1,000 years, there's the recreation of heaven and earth. And again, that is at least a tertiary issue, right? That might be a fourth level issue. It's just not that important. It certainly does not pertain anything to our salvation. But again, after the tribulation, Christians alive go through the tribulation. After the tribulation, Christ appears. Satan is bound for 1,000 years and cast into the bottomless pit for a specific purpose. We saw here in Revelation 20, verse 3, he's bound and cast into the pit so that he might not deceive the nations any longer. So he's bound for a specific purpose, that he might not deceive the nations any longer during this millennium kingdom. So Satan has no active influence on the earth during the millennial kingdom. From this perspective, you still have unbelievers, and they're still unbelievers, but Satan does not have this active influence to deceive the nations. At the end of the 1,000 years, Satan will be loosed from the bottomless pit and will join forces with the unbelievers who have continued to rebel or have feigned submission to Christ. Whatever the case will be, he will join forces with them for one final attack on Christ and Christians. And that battle is recorded in Revelation, and it's very short. Like it lasts a minute, right? And Christ defeats him fully and finally in just a moment. Once all the forces are gathered, Christ says, okay, that's enough, and just puts an end to it. Then, so just to clarify, when Christ returns at the end of the tribulation, believers who have died are raised, believers who are alive are glorified, and both are glorified together. But unbelievers are still in the grave. Their bodies are still in the grave. Their souls are in the temporary holding place of hell until the final judgment. So at the end of the 1,000 years, Satan is loosed, deceives nations, pulls people in, is ultimately defeated. Then unbelievers are raised from the dead and are judged according to their works. The books are opened, they are judged, and then they are cast eternally into the lake of fire. That's the final judgment. So you've got the two resurrections. You've got the resurrection of believers when Christ returns, and the resurrection of unbelievers at the end of the 1,000-year reign of Christ. That is the historic premillennial position. Unlike dispensationalism that we'll look at next week, there is no sharp Israel church distinction. Dispensationalism really, of course, when we're talking about eschatology here and these different positions, we can't help but paint with a broad brush. Everything I say about historic premillennialism, a lot of premillennials believe. Everything I'm going to say about dispensationalism, a lot of dispensationalists believe, but not everybody. So I can't help but paint with a broad brush. You can't help but do that when talking about eschatology. So in dispensationalism, you've got promises to Israel in the Old Testament that they understand have not been fulfilled. But with historic premillennialism, generally the understanding is these promises are fulfilled in the New Testament church. So in historic premillennialism, there's not a hard and fast line between Israel and the church. And I don't think there should be a hard and fast line. I'm not dispensational. I've not told you yet what I am, but I'm not dispensational. God has one people. Now, it's true that Old Testament believers aren't the church. That's true. Jesus says, I will build my church in Matthew 18. And we saw in Mark 8 recently, right? And so that's something new. But it does not mean that they are not equally God's people. It does not mean that we're going to see two distinct groups of people in heaven, Israel and the church, and they're going to be different. That's not the case. But historic premillennialism does not have this sharp distinction. Unlike dispensationalism, historic premillennialism has no secret rapture, like the Left Behind movies, when bam, all the Christians are just vanished, right? And then the world goes into chaos for 7 years. That secret rapture is not in historic premillennialism. Dispensationalism has the church age, the rapture of believers, resurrection of believers, 7-year tribulation, and then those raptured believers they come back to earth at the end of that 7-year tribulation with Christ. Their bodies are raised, they're reunited with their bodies and go into the millennial reign. So you've got a secret, what you would call a secret coming of Christ, where he comes in the clouds, but he don't come all the way to earth. He descends, Christians are caught up, and he's gone. That's in dispensationalism, but it's not historic premillennialism. So with historic or classical premillennialism, there's no secret rapture. And unlike dispensationalism, the church remains on earth through the tribulation. So some strengths that are commonly claimed for, and advocating for historic premillennialism is that it takes Revelation 20 seriously as futuristic, future history. Things are going to happen in the future. It does emphasize the physical reign of Christ. So you've got the literal understanding, the plain reading of Scripture. You've got the physical reign of Christ. It accounts for continued evil prior to Christ's return. There's continued evil in the world before Christ returns. It aligns with early church expectations of suffering. Think about when John wrote. Now, one of the things we'll talk about in the coming weeks is very important. We're going to talk about when the book of Revelation was written. That's a very important deal. Some argue that it was written in the 60s, and some argue that it was written in the 90s. And it's a big deal. You might not understand why now, and I'm about to tell you. You just got to come back. But whether it was written in the 60s or the 90s, Christians are, in both cases, under heavy persecution. And so when they would have received the apocalyptic letter, it would have been encouraging to them that, man, I've got to endure this persecution, right? In the opening chapter of Revelation, John says, I'm your partner, how's he say it? I share, however he says, I forget, in the tribulation. So he might not be talking about the capital T tribulation in the future, but in the opening words of Revelation, he says, I'm with you in the tribulation. So they are presently suffering, presently facing trial and tribulation, but the book assures them that will come to an end and Christ will reign. So it aligns with early church expectations of suffering. We don't have an expectation of suffering today. That's why when we suffer, we feel so out of place. We think God's let us down. But in fact, Christians for 2,000 years have suffered, and we are not exempt from suffering. Another thing, though, it can be traced, like I said, traced to the first century. And I think I said this last week, but like these charts that we have and these 4 distinct millennial positions, there was no hard and fast line separating these positions in the early church. So you could read one church father, and he says something that sounds kind of premillennial. But then you turn a few pages, you read the same father, and he says something that sounds kind of amillennial that we'll look at in 2 weeks. There was no hard and fast line. So some see a church father named Papias, P-A-P-I-S, Papias, as an advocate for the premillennial position. We don't have any of Papias's writings. What we have is what Papias said, quoted by Eusebius in the 3rd century, or 4th century, I guess. And so it's probably accurate. We have no reason to think it's not true. But he believed in a future 1,000-year reign of Christ. And Papias lived in the late 1st century. And if I'm not mistaken, I might be mistaken. I'll double check this, but lived in Ephesus, which means he would have been affiliated with John the Apostle. John, who lived into the 90s and was an elder in Ephesus, and here Papias is in Ephesus in the late 1st century. But some other things that Papias said does not incline itself to this historic premillennial position. But Some of the things he says certainly does. But into the 2nd century, you've got Justin Martyr and Irenaeus, who both seem to affirm the literal future 1,000-year reign of Christ. Some common critiques of historic premillennialism. There's a lot, but there's critiques of all these positions, by the way. This is why it's all across the board. I might have 2 preachers I love to listen to, and they disagree 180 degrees on these things. There's problem passages for whichever position you take. But some common critiques. There's difficulty reconciling with New Testament emphasis that seems to be on one resurrection. If you read Jesus' words in John, the resurrection of the just and the unjust, it seems to look like through Scripture that there's one resurrection. The time where it looks like there might be 2 is in a very symbolic book, Revelation. It looks like there might be 2 in this very symbolic book. It requires a return to death and rebellion at the end of Christ's reign. Now, that's what we see in Revelation 20, depending on how we understand Revelation 20. And here's the biggest one, I think, for me. Historic premillennialism must explain how glorified and unglorified people can coexist on one planet at the same time. Christians who have been resurrected receive glorified, perfect bodies, no inclination to sin. You look at Jesus' resurrected body in the New Testament, and he can apparently walk through walls, right? Apparently he can appear and disappear out of people's sight. And unbelievers still living and still dying, living on the same planet. That's a hard thing to reconcile. This is a very popular end times position, historic premillennialism, but it's got to account for glorified believers and unglorified unbelievers coexisting. And if people are converted to Christ during this time, how does that work? Do they hear the gospel presented? Do they come to Christ and say, that's it, Christ, I'm going to bow to you, you are my Lord? Then poof, they're glorified? Or do they live in unglorified bodies as Christians? Right? That's kind of there's a tension there. So let's look at how historic premillennialism shapes Christian living. Whatever our doctrinal position is on anything, it does affect how we live our lives. So historic premillennialism, if we hold to that, we see a strong expectation of suffering, right? Especially when the church is going to go through the tribulation. The church is to expect suffering. It ought not to surprise us. We're going to go through it. There is hope, though, that is rooted in Christ's return. There is emphasis on perseverance. Perseverance over what we might call optimism. So when we get to amillennialism and postmillennialism, you're going to see this concept of an optimistic eschatology, that the church grows, that through believers on earth and more people coming across the world, by result of that, kind of becomes better. You see, when Christianity influences a nation, that kind of thing. So that's an optimistic eschatology, but with historic premillennialism, you can hold to historic premillennialism and have this optimistic understanding, but usually you don't. The emphasis is on perseverance, on hanging on as you go through suffering. We also see faithfulness in hardship. And this view prepares believers to endure before they expect to reign. So, in summary here, Christ returns before the millennium and at the end of the 7-year tribulation. The millennium is future and literal. According to historic premillennialism, we are not in the millennium now. Now, I'll tell you, just spoiler alert, in amillennialism and postmillennialism, we are in the millennium now, or heading to the millennium now. We'll look at that in 2 or 3 weeks from now. So Christ returns before the millennium. The millennium is future and literal, and we are not in it yet. The church goes through tribulation, not just regular tribulation that we should expect, but a distinct time of tribulation that most affirm to be a 7-year period. There's really no hard and fast reason for it to be 7-year, but most teach that it'll be a 7-year period. And in historic premillennialism, there is one visible return of Christ, not a secret rapture 7 years before the visible return of Christ. And there is also emphasis, again, on endurance and hope. So next week, we'll look at the other premillennial view, but one that introduces some significant structural changes, and that's dispensational premillennialism that we will look at next week. But we have a couple of minutes. So do we have any questions on any of this? Oh, yeah, ask it. No. The wicked are resurrected into judgment. So in the premillennial position, when everybody dies, your immaterial part, your soul, your spirit goes to heaven or goes to hell. Your body lays in the grave, whether you're a believer or unbeliever. According to both premillennial positions, at the rapture or the resurrection of believers, their bodies are raised, their spirits are united, they reign with Christ, live with Christ, go into the eternal state with Christ. Unbelievers stay in the prison of hell during that whole time. And then at the end of the 1,000-year reign, they are resurrected, and their bodies are resurrected, their souls and spirits are put back in their bodies, and then they stand before Christ to be judged. So it's kind of like if someone is arrested now and they're put in holding until their court date. So hell, in that sense, it's a long holding time, right? Could be thousands of years. Like Goliath is there right now, right? I mean, it's thousands of years he's been there. But at the last day, at the last resurrection, the last judgment, even Goliath and I don't want to speculate, but unbeliever, Ahab, right? Ahab and Jezebel are in hell right now. And they're going to be resurrected, put back in their bodies. Man, that was torment, And they're going to stand before God. God's going to judge them. All right, now's your court date. And then they're sentenced to the lake of fire. So yeah, I went a long way around to get to that. So in that sense, it depends on how you translate those words, the hell and the lake of fire and how you translate those. But according to this position, where unbelievers are now is torment and torture and hell, but then they're going to be resurrected in the future and then cast into the lake of fire. So it's not a second chance; it's a final judgment. So, yeah. Oh, sure thing. Good. Yeah. If you think I'm teaching heresy, please ask a question. False teaching. Oh no. Yeah. No. Okay. Because if I say that they have a second chance, that is wrong. So if you think I might say that, ask me. Yep. So in this position, they've not been judged yet. They're in hell because they died outside of Christ. It's appointed the man wants to die, and after that, the judgment. That does not necessarily mean the judgment is immediately after that. It just means once you die, there's nothing you can change about the way you died and how your eternity is going to be. Yep. So.
My mind is going blank. Which stance believes that there's like part of the things that are going to happen in Revelation are in the past back before 70 and then some of it's for the future, but some of it's already happened.
Well, that's another term that we'll learn as we go. That's generally postmillennialism, but the word you're probably looking for is preterism.
Yeah. Okay.
Preterism. And preterism, again, we'll really tackle this more. But when you look at Revelation, you can look at it as being symbolic of something that has already happened. Amillennial positions, some of them see it as like cyclical, like Revelation is telling a repetitive story using different imagery that spans all of the church period. It's just different ways of telling the same thing, and it absolutely applies today, 1,000 years ago, and 1,000 years in the future. And then there are some who see it all as the future and hasn't even happened yet. And I see a problem with dispensationalism there. What good does the book do to us? What good does the book do to the first century? They receive this epistle or this apocalyptic letter and say, man, these people 2,500 years from now are going to have it rough. This don't have anything to do with me. So I have a hard time with dispensationalism, and that's one reason. But no, it's dangerous.
I'm trying to get it in. I'm like, okay.
Yeah, it's dangerous.
I don't know about people growing up. I didn't learn about any of this. I only came into and so it was just
it wasn't bad. It was just kind of shallow.
Yeah, that was
just like, listen, God, what you supposed to do? I'm like, okay, this is getting like, this is deep. Mm-hmm. Open up a part of my brain. I'm like, take it in, Chris.
Well,
it's okay to go slow with this because it gets overwhelming.
Yeah,
it really does. There was a point where I was like, I need to know all of this right now. Once I came back,
where does this work? No, go back, go back.
Yeah, please do that. I don't. There's an element to this that's kind of lectury and kind of teachy, but please, I don't want to run off and leave you. I have a position on eschatology. You might know it, you might not. I'm not saying it yet, but I was raised sort of amillennial, which we've not covered amillennialism yet. It's the middle one on the next page. It was never preached, never taught, but the understanding of Scripture was kind of amillennial-like. And then I became dispensational, which is what we'll look at next week. It's the top one on that back page. And I was hardcore dispensational, and I thought, you know what? I just don't know about this. So I went for a long time doing what most Christians do that aren't dispensational, and I just kind of put eschatology on the back burner. I ironed out some other theological things. I worried about other things. I kind of thought, I'll just be millennial. It'll all pan out in the end. Lord, surprise me,
Which is a fair stance.
It's a fair stance. Right. But I said, I've got to dig into this because, two different pastors I hold high esteem. Okay, let me say 4 different pastors I hold in very high esteem hold each one of those positions. I said, one of them is right, one of them is wrong, 3 of them, maybe 4 of them are wrong, right? I mean, who knows? But I said, I want to know where I stand, and I'm now standing in a different place, but we'll talk about this as we move forward. Anything else?